Hello students, today we will be discussing the topic Regional Aspirations Case Study of Northeast India. The objective behind today's discussion is to give you an insight about the tribal policy during the British rule, tribal policy in the post-independence period, the constitutional provisions pertaining to tribals as well as autonomy, statehood and Northeast India. Given the wide range of areas that would be covering, for the convenience of our understanding, I have divided the entire area of our discussion into a number of segments. We would start first by understanding the nature of tribes in India, then we would move on to tribal governance in British India, independence and the question of tribal autonomy, the Constituent Assembly debates on tribal statehood, Nehru and tribal autonomy. Then we would move on to the 5th and 6th schedule of the Constitution, which provides tribal autonomy provisions, the tribal policy, autonomy and statehood in India. Now, tribes constitute an important part of the Indian population. India has the second largest tribal population after Africa. According to the 2011 census of India, 8.6% of the total population of India constitute the tribes. The tribes are mainly concentrated in northeast part of India, the Union territories of Andaman, Lakshadweep, Dadar and Nagar Haveli. Some of the most important tribal communities are the Khasis, Nagas, Mizos, Garos, Karbis, Dimashas, Bodos, Mishings, Rabhas, Lalungs, concentrated in Northeast India. In the central part of India, we have the Santals, Mundas, Hos, Khariyas, Pahariyas, Oraons, Gonds, etc. And the Adivasis inhabiting the western region of the country comprises of the Gonds, Bhils, Kurkus, Kols, etc. Koyas, Todas and Banjaras constitute the main tribal community found in South India, including Ong and others in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. In spite of the domination in certain regions of the country, tribals in India have been socio-economically oppressed, culturally subjugated and politically marginalized for centuries. Let us try to understand tribal governance in British India. What was the British policy towards the tribals? Did the tribals participate in the Indian national movement? Let us try to find answers to these questions. At the initial stages, the British officials were not interested in the tribals because these people lived an isolated life and had their own customary rules and laws to which the British were virtually ignorant. The British followed a policy of expediency in which tribal interests were subordinated to larger colonial interests. This policy discontented the tribals and they revolted against the colonial rulers. Consequently, a series of rebellions occurred in the country, beginning with the Kol insurrection of 1831-32, Santhal revolt of 1885, the Basta rising of 1911, civil disobedience by Kol Malyas of Orissa and Tana Bhagats in 1920. These rebellions forced the British government to revise its policy towards the tribals, resulting in the enactment of a number of regulations and acts to minimize exploitation and maintaining law and order in the tribal areas. Now, let us try to understand the regulations and laws passed by the British government. The British government enacted Regulation 1 of 1796 for making special arrangement for tribal regions. Regulation 13 of 1833 for the first time recognized that administrative policies applicable to advanced regions of Bengal and Bihar cannot be applied to the isolated tribal regions. This regulation demarcated certain areas, especially Chota Nagpur, as non-regulated areas for administering them in a special manner because they were essentially populated by the Adivasis. Another landmark enactment was the Garo Hills Act of 1869, which provided for the administration of the Garo Hills, Jaintia Hills, Naga Hills and portion of the Khasi Hills that was part of British India under the control of officers appointed by the Lieutenant Governor. The Garo Hills Act may be said to have paved the path for separate procedural machinery for the administration of criminal and civil justice in these areas and for application of such laws in these areas which are in force in other territories as are found suitable. The Montague-Chelmsford Reform of 1918 further took up the question of administration of these backward tracts. After extensive analysis of these areas, the report stated that there were certain backward areas which should be directly governed by the governor. In consonance with the report, the Government of India Act 1919 was enacted for the purpose of giving special treatment to the tribal areas otherwise designated as backward tracts. Thus, the Act manifested the concern of the British government towards the tribals and thereby revised its earlier policy of isolation towards the tribes. The Government of India Act 1935 described these areas as excluded areas or partially excluded areas, and the governor was given exclusive power and discretion in the governance of these tracts. Shortly after the enactment of the Government of India Act 1935, the governor promulgated the Government of India Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas Order 1936 to delineate excluded areas and partially excluded areas within the territory of Assam. Let's come to the question of tribal autonomy at the juncture of Indian independence. The decision to transfer powers to the Indians also brought in the question of the mode of administration of the tribal areas. Verrier Elwin, who had spent most of his life working among the tribals, emphasized that immediately after independence, it was essential to adopt certain special measures to integrate the tribes. To quote Verrier Elwin, first, to preserve, strengthen and develop all that is best in tribal society, culture, art and language. The second is to protect tribal economic rights. The third is to unite and integrate the tribes in the true heart unity with India as a whole so that they may play a full part in the whole life. And the last is to develop welfare and educational facilities so that every tribesman may have an equal opportunity with the fellow citizens of the open country and the plains. However, not only the Indian leaders were concerned over the future course of action of the tribes themselves were busy entertaining different ideas regarding their future position. The Khasis were divided on the question of whether to demand a separate sovereign state or separation from Assam or a federal status with Assam. Similarly, the Nagas were also divided on the question of autonomy and independence. The Mikis were in favor of autonomy in local matters within the state of Assam. The Garos favored similar treatment of the hills and plains. They demanded similar treatment. The Maharaja of Manipur clamored for separate political status for Manipur. Now, these were the different aspirations of the tribes post-independence. Now, the question of tribal autonomy, protection of tribal interests was also debated in the Constituent Assembly. In consonance with the Cabinet Mission statement, the Advisory Committee on the Rights of Citizens, Minorities and the Tribal and Excluded Areas set up 3 subcommittees on. The first committee was nomenclatured the Northeast Frontier Assam Tribal and Excluded Areas. The second subcommittee was called the Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas in the province other than Assam. The third subcommittee was called the Tribal Areas in the Northwest Frontier Province and Balochistan. The reports submitted by the first 2 subcommittees were intensely debated in the Constituent Assembly, whereby it was proposed by Ambedkar that the provisions of the 5th schedule would apply to the administration and control of the scheduled areas and scheduled tribes in the states other than Assam. the provisions of the 6th schedule would apply to the tribal areas of Assam. Now, let us try to understand what was the vision of the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, on the issue of tribal autonomy. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru well understood the aspirations of the tribals. He envisaged that tribals would be given autonomy to develop their identity and culture. To quote Nehru, the tribals should be given as much freedom and autonomy as possible so that they can live their own lives according to their customs and desires. He further urged the members of the Constituent Assembly to make appropriate provisions for the tribals, keeping in view the uniqueness of the tribal culture. The tribal policy was shaped and significantly influenced by the top leadership's enthusiasm for the preservation of the tribal culture, their rich cultural heritage and their distinct identity which they had preserved for centuries and which even the colonial rulers did not destroy. It was foremost in the minds of the Indian statesmen, especially Nehru, who emphatically believed that India to them should signify not only a protecting force but also a liberating one. There were two major approaches regarding the place to be accorded to the tribals in Indian society. One approach was to leave the tribal people alone, uncontaminated by modern influences operating outside the world, and to let them stay more or less as they were. The second approach was that of assimilating them completely and as quickly as possible into the Indian society all around them. Nehru rejected both these approaches. The first approach of treating the tribal people signified to him that they would be like museum specimens to be observed and written about later, and this was to Nehru to insult them. The second approach of allowing them to be engulfed by the masses of the Indian humanity would lead to the destruction of their cultural identity according to Nehru. Instead of these two approaches, Nehru adopted the policy of integrating the tribal people in Indian society, of making them an integral part of the Indian nation even while maintaining their distinct identity and culture. Nehru framed a well comprehensive policy for the advancement of the tribals, which is vividly depicted in the foreword of 9th October 1958 to the second edition of Verrier Elwin's A Philosophy of NEFA. NEFA stood for Northeast Frontier Agency. These avenues of development should, however, be pursued within the broad framework of the following 5 fundamental principles. Nehru laid down 5 principles for tribal autonomy and integration. The first principle provided that people should develop along the lines of their own genius and we should avoid imposing anything on them. We should try to encourage in every way their own traditional arts and culture. Tribal rights in land and forest should be respected. Third, we should try to train them and build up a team of their own people to do the work of administration and development. Some technical personnel from outside will no doubt be needed, especially in the beginning, but we should avoid introducing too many outsiders to their territory. Fourthly, we should not over-administer these areas or overwhelm them with multiplicity of schemes. We should rather work through and not in rivalry to their own social and cultural institutions. Finally, we should judge results not by statistics or the amount of money spent, but by the quality of human character that is involved. Nehru's intense concern for the protection of the complex diversity of the tribes is also reflected in his letters to the chief ministers, written during the early 1950s, when he urged them not to treat them by some single formula because they greatly differ among themselves. It seems obviously undesirable to deny them some kind of self-government in the country. Emphasizing on the need for some political, administrative and institutional mechanism to protect the distinct identities of the Northeast, Nehru opined that the policy of the government should provide a certain measure of autonomy to them within the Indian Union. Even after Nehru's death, the successive governments adopted an accommodative stance towards them. Let us come to the very important provisions of the Constitution, the 5th and the 6th schedule of the Constitution. The Constitution of India Schedules 5 and 6 contain special provisions for self-governance for certain areas and communities. The areas mentioned were scheduled areas in states other than Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, Mizoram in northeast and the tribal inhabited areas in the states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. Even though such areas fall within some states or union territories, such special provisions have been made to accommodate tribal aspirations. The President of India has been empowered to declare an area scheduled area subject to legislation by Parliament, and the President has exercised such powers under the 5th schedule of the Constitution. Now, what is this 5th schedule? The 5th schedule of the Constitution provides for the administration and governance of scheduled areas as well as that of scheduled tribes in states other than Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. This schedule provides for the formation of tribal advisory councils to give advice on matters relating to welfare and administration of the scheduled tribes in these states, as may be referred to them by the governor. The governor is authorized to direct that any act of Parliament or of the state legislature shall not apply to a scheduled area or shall apply subject to certain modifications. In terms of self-governance rights, the Schedule 6 is far more empowering. It provides for district and regional councils. The 6th schedule provides for that there shall be a district council for each autonomous district consisting of not more than 30 members, of whom not more than 4% shall be nominated by the governor and the rest shall be elected on the basis of adult franchise. It should be noted that these councils, though they have been set up to promote tribal way of life, yet they follow democratic procedure of electing the members. These tribal areas are to be governed as autonomous districts. Now, these councils have the power to collect, assess land revenue and impose certain specific taxes. Laws made by these councils should be assented by the governor before they are implemented. The legislative autonomy of the councils has been protected by the Constitution with the provision that the acts of the state legislature shall not extend to such areas unless the particular council so directs by a public notification. So, there can be no imposition of authority by the central legislature unless it is consented to by the governor and the tribal councils. Let us come to the next important part of the discussion, Northeast and reorganization of Northeast after the independence. Northeast Frontier Agency was created in 1948 as a union territory consisting of the border areas of Assam. It was placed under the control of a special group of officials who were entrusted with the task of protecting the rich cultural and ethnic diversity of the tribals. NEFA was later on renamed as Arunachal Pradesh and was bestowed the status of state in the year 1987. The decades from the 70s witnessed the country redrawing the map of Northeast India and the enactment of the Northeast Areas Reorganization Act 1971 and the Northeast Council Act of 1971. The challenge before the policy makers was to redesign the state structure to give a voice to the plural realities of the region. During the state's reorganization of India in 1956, 14 states were created based on language. This we have already studied. In the Northeast, however, only Assam was reorganized on the basis of language. The demands of the minority groups for a Nagaland state to be created out of Assam and for separation of Mizo areas from Assam was not met. On the contrary, the State Reorganization Commission suggested an enlargement of the state of Assam to include Tripura and Manipur. This proposal was put forward on the grounds of administrative efficiency, regional stability, resource constraints and security needs, even though Assam was going to be a multilingual state, a development that ran counter to the Commission's original policy. This suggestion was not accepted. 4 states, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Meghalaya and Mizoram were separated from Assam one after the other. These 4 states were the areas to which entry was regulated during the British period. In the 4 states, even before independence, there were several indigenous cultural and political organizations representing the interest of the hill peoples. After independence, some of these groups began to pursue political activities including protest against unity with Assam, a demand for expansion of autonomy within Assam and a demand for separation from Assam and a further demand for statehood. Dissatisfaction of this kind led to the demand for autonomy. The tribes were extremely dissatisfied by the idea of clubbing them within the state of Assam. So, they demanded for the establishment of separate states. When the answers fell short of what they had demanded, discontents led to anti-government agitation and in some cases armed conflicts with the government. After Assam, the first state to achieve statehood in the northeast was Nagaland, and that was in the year 1963. The Tuensang area, which was defined as the Naga tribal area in the constitution, was formed with a district within the Northeast Frontier Agency. In 1957, the Tuensang area was joined with the Naga Hills district to form the Naga Hills Tuensang area as a central government administrative area. Thereafter, NHTA was renamed as Nagaland by the Nagaland Territorial Provisions Regulation of India Act 1961. The regulation of 1961 was replaced with the State of Nagaland Act of 1962, which made Nagaland a full-fledged state within the Indian Union. The state of Nagaland was inaugurated in December 1963. The establishment of Nagaland brought similar demands for statehood from other hill regions, and secessionist movements for the creation of states started. For instance, at the time of the state's reorganization, representatives from Khasi and Jaintia Hills district and the Garo Hills district expressed the hope of forming their own hill state, Garo, Khasi, Jaintia Hill state. This was not accepted by the state's reorganization commission. But the aspiration turned into a stronger demand for statehood when Assamese was proposed as Assam's state's official language in the Language Bill of 1960. The representatives of the hill areas formed an all-party hill leaders conference in July 1960 and demanded separation of the hill area from Assam. The movement for statehood continued, and in the year 1970, Meghalaya autonomous state was established. It became a full-fledged state in the year 1972. The process of state formation in the northeast was comparatively peaceful for the case of Meghalaya, because the movement mostly coincided within the framework of India. And the hill state was distinctive insofar as the majority of the population belonged to 2 major ethnic communities, the Khasis and the Garos, each of them inhabiting their own territory in the hills. The Mizo Hills area, which was an excluded area during the British period, became the Lushai Hills district within the Assam at the time of independence, and in 1954 was renamed Mizo Hills district of Assam. A separatist movement from Assam was active even before independence, and we are quite aware of that. Against the backdrop of the prevalent discontentment with government relief works to the victims of the famine of Motam in 1959 to 1961, and under the guidance of Lal Denga, a Mizo leader, the movement for a separate state started. As in the case of Nagaland, the government first started to suppress this movement, the Mizo movement, by military force. Then it tried to reach an accord within the moderates and with the MNF in 1972. Finally, the government established Mizoram with the status of a union territory, and when the Mizos were not really happy, Union Territory of Mizoram was upgraded to full statehood in the year 1987. Tripura, a princely state at the time of independence, and Manipur became a central government administrative agency after they joined India in 1949. They were given the status of union territories, and later in 1972 they became the Tripura state and the Manipur state. In the case of Arunachal Pradesh, the shift to statehood was quite peaceful. It was executed at the initiative of the central government. The area was integrated into Assam at the time of independence. But adjoining China and with an unsettled border, the area had a military importance for the central government and was put under direct government control. The area was upgraded to become Union Territory in 1972, and the year 1982 it became a full-fledged state. The formation of Arunachal Pradesh can be understood as a part of the process of state formation in the northeast, but at the same time it might also be possible to interpret Arunachal Pradesh's promotions to statehood as a move by the Indian government aimed at indicating to China that national integration was being achieved even in the frontier region of northeast India. What can be deduced from this entire discussion? What was the stance of the government towards the northeast tribal communities? Sympathetic to the cause of the tribes pertaining to exploitation, marginalization, alienation, insecurity, etc., the government of India during the 1960s to 1980s adopted a number of democratic and constitutional measures to preserve the unity and identity of the tribes, which has been the ethos of the Indian state since independence. This is not to say that the process of grant of statehood, sub-statehood to the tribal communities of the northeast have been completely mitigated. The continuous process of accommodation made by the government over these decades and the flexibility of the government in devising newer and newer ways and means of giving them autonomy. The state of Nagaland, formed in 1962, part of Assam reorganized to form the autonomous state of Meghalaya in 1969, Manipur and Tripura as states in 1972, Mizoram and Arunachal Pradesh union territories in 1971 and full-fledged states in 1987 are wonderful experiments at accommodating the tribal identities. The provisions of the 6th schedule was designed to provide them special powers and responsibilities. The basic objective of these different forms of decentralization, federalization is to protect the tribal ways of life in a democratic manner. Northeast students provide a peculiar challenge to the process of national integration. It may be said that the second reorganization of Indian states in the northeast, unlike the first reorganization, was guided towards a particular region, and that we have already understood is the northeast, and towards a particular multicultural identifier, and that is the tribes. It also sought to serve the need for protecting the territorial integrity of the tribes. Commitment to such an identity was well within the limits of democracy and constitutionalism. But we should also remember the fact that there are problems of insurgencies, militancy seeking separation from India, or demands for greater recognition, cross-state movements, migration from neighboring states, creating newer and newer fault lines within the northeastern states. But the resilience of the region and policies need to be appreciated, keeping in mind the upsurge of secessionist movements around the globe. Again, it may be emphatically maintained that India has created a syncretic model of governance combining autonomy to regions and layered order within an overarching political universe. More so, the call for greater dialogues is open. This positive aspect of community formation through different democratic processes and representative institutions amidst the turmoil of the last few decades needs to be appreciated and acknowledged in the light of the present world order. Thank you.